All right, I guess since we have the recording in progress notice, that's our cue to get started this morning. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here. I'm Terry Marks. I'm one of the Center's Board of Directors, and I'm here to introduce Kathleen King and our presentation this morning, Social Emotional Learning and Anti-Racism, Building on the Assets of Marginalized Students. I did just post the session description in the chat box, and you also have that available in your conference program. So just go ahead and take a look at that. Just to introduce Kathleen, she's an associate professor at North Central College and the internship coordinator for its graduate educational leadership program. Her current research interests are centered on social emotional learning, leadership, equity, school cultures of character, and wellness. So with that, I'll turn over the session to Kathleen, and I'll also be supporting with monitoring the chat as we go through. And Kathleen, are you okay if questions come in? Do you want to save those towards the end, or do you want to answer them throughout?
No, by all means, interrupt me. So,
All right, perfect. We will make sure to do that. So you heard her. If you've got questions, go ahead and post them in the chat box and we can go ahead and flag that. You can also raise your hand. I don't know if everybody knows about that feature in Zoom, but you can raise your hand and under your reactions button, and we'll be able to see if you've got a question.
thank you so much, Terry. And definitely, we would like this to be as interactive as possible. We will not be using breakout rooms, so I'll be using the chat box heavily. So if you want to try to locate your chat box now, please do so. And I'll at periodic moments ask you to add things to the chat box so I can hear from you. But by all means, typing questions. I won't be monitoring those questions. I'm so grateful to have Terry help monitor that conversation while I'm actually doing the presenting. But raising your hand and asking questions throughout or commenting to one another is all invited. We really want this to be as interactive as possible. And you don't even have to pay extra for the sound effects of the clock chimes going off or the lawnmowers outside the window. That is with no extra cost, all for your entertainment pleasure today. So let's get started. The title of this talk is Social Emotional Learning and Anti-Racism, and really wanting to examine that intersection so that we can see how that social emotional learning can help us be anti-racist, even as we also examine some criticisms of social emotional learning as actually perpetuating racism when it's done poorly. We really want to make sure that, therefore, that we're building on the assets of marginalized students rather than using social emotional learning as another way of weaponizing or demeaning students. So I look forward to this morning with you. I'd like to start, if we're going to talk about social emotional learning, we have a tendency to talk about it for others. And it really has to start with us as leaders, as individuals who are trying to serve our students. We really need to make sure that we ourselves are attending to our social and emotional well-being. So I like us to start by just taking a moment and sitting in a relaxed posture, but in a chair, perhaps not maybe sending you off to sleep again this morning, but really maybe closing your eyes, killing your screen if you feel more comfortable doing so, but certainly come back. I love seeing those faces, but taking a moment to just connect with the sensation of your seated body. And as you do so, take 3 long, deep, nourishing breaths. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And letting your breath settle into its own rhythm. And as you get centered, if you can just kind of reflect upon what is your intention for today. As you think about today and the people that you'll interact with and these sessions that you'll encounter, how might you show up today to best benefit, to be present and open and reflective? What quality of mind do you want strengthened, and how can you feel more connected? Now, I know that was a very short moment, but I hope it gave us just a chance to kind of stop and try to be present today, and that we could feel in a very real way how important that tending to social emotional learning can be for our students by seeing how important it is to tend to it ourselves. So let's start with your chat box. I put down 5 descriptors, and I'm wondering which of these might most closely align to you to describe you as you approach the session today. I'll put at 1 in the chat box if you're just starting to learn more about social emotional learning. 2, if you feel comfortable with social emotional learning and want to learn about how it intersects with equity. A 3, if you feel comfortable with social emotional learning, but you have concerns that it doesn't serve equity. 4, if you're comfortable with social emotional learning and you have experienced it as addressing equity issues. Or 5, none of the above. And I will freely admit the limitations of those descriptors and that you might not feel that comfortable with any of them, but it's just a way to get us started.
So Kathleen, I'm not sure if you're able to see the chat box, but there's a number of people responding right now. We've got quite a bit of a range going on right now.
I see. Thank you for, because I don't always have all of my side boxes working well, but I do see that right now. So looks like maybe a little more of a dominance of 3 and possibly 4, but we definitely do have that full range. And nice of you to commit. I have very few 5s here. So thank you very much for your participation in that. So that's helpful. It gives me a starting point, and perhaps it helps you in a very benign way see a little bit of who's in the room with you right now as we begin this learning journey together. So what I'm going to do in this session is just 4 quick parts. 1 is look at the social emotional learning landscape so that we have an opportunity to kind of see where this idea came from. I think that's important as we look at its next chapter as transformative SEL that is more centered on equity work. We want to look at some of the research about SEL that pertains to student achievement and to marginalized students. I'm going to share with you just some brief results from a study on students who are in intervention programs that talks a little bit about assets. And then finally, we will talk about what we can do to build on students' assets. And I will be looking throughout this to continue to get your ideas and to hear your questions so that we can truly be learning together. All right, so let's jump into that landscape. I mean, for social emotional learning that we're talking about today, we very often are relying on the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, CASEL, which is actually based out of UIC, and that has really had a very close relationship with standards for social emotional learning in schools. Certainly it is in Illinois. The definition of SEL from CASEL is the basis for the Illinois social emotional learning standards. And you can see here that it talks about it developing healthy identities, managing emotions and goals, empathy, relationships, and decision making. And probably the big 5 that you hear about with social emotional learning comes right from CASEL, and that's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision making, and relationship skills. I do want to point out that's not the only definition of social emotional learning, and it certainly is not the only areas for targeting. There are just a plethora, and even character education is included under that umbrella of social emotional learning. Rutgers Lab calls itself SECD rather than SEL, and that's social emotional character development, because they think it's important that we recognize it's not just about making decisions, it's about making good decisions. And so it includes more of the ethical moral imperatives. Yale and Harvard both have labs that are devoted just to social emotional learning. And you will get a copy of this PowerPoint that will be provided both by the center, and the last slide gives a link to it. So you can use these live links to access those resources if you'd like. But in the bottom right corner of the slide, you can see a kind of a new definition of SEL that's trying to show more the intersection of SEL with equity work. And that's been a more recent development in SEL, is recognizing that need to have it embrace anti-racism. And so to give you a little bit of history of SEL, it's not new. Way back in '69, Yale started its work with social emotional learning, but the term really came out of the '80s and '90s with, and Weisberg right now is one of the leaders of CASEL. And Maurice Elias is the one who does the SECD lab at Rutgers that I just mentioned. So that work and those individuals who helped start it are still very active in the field. And CASEL started in '94, and the book, I don't know if Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman is something you're familiar with, but all that added to SEL all through the '90s. In some ways, we make it seem like it's a rather new entity, but it's really just gaining in prominence within the schools. Illinois has been on the forefront. Actually, there was a Mental Health Act of 2003 that inspired the start of the Illinois SEL standards. And we were the first in the nation to adopt standards. And in fact, definitely one of the first with PK through 12 standards. All 50 states have PK standards, but Illinois was the first to adopt it in a comprehensive way. And since then, we've also seen funding streams coming from the federal government, like ESSA, that is the renewal of No Child Left Behind, that's been very supportive of SEL work. And we're seeing employers talk about the importance of soft skills or social emotional learning. So we're kind of at this key point, and the pandemic just added to it, where this realization of how important SEL is really at the forefront. And as you know, at the same time, even though we've had equity issues throughout the country for generations, we're also at a time in our country's history where we're trying to reckon with that in new ways. And so this intersection becomes very important. I just referenced this, but you can see here, these are links to the states that do have the pre-K through 12. There are 14 of them. 29 states have the guidelines. And as mentioned, there's some states that only have it for preschool at this time, but it's continuing to emerge as and be recognized as an essential aspect of school outcomes. And this is kind of that CASEL framework, just for reference. I put this slide up so you could see those 5 in the middle, but also see how it talks about through those outer rings, the importance of community and family and a classroom, that it has to be built well beyond just a lesson that's being taught in some mini way within the classroom. And we've got some great comments going in the chat box. So by all means, continue to have those. I did also want to talk, as we talk about being on the forefront in Illinois, that Illinois also this year adopted the Illinois Culturally Responsive Standards for Teachers and Leaders. And this is not in PK-12 schools, but it's for preparation of teachers and preparation of leaders. And you can see as you glance at this, some of the same terminology that we spoke about with SEL, the self-awareness, the relationships, that idea of student advocacy and individualism and family and community. So there's definitely this kind of intersection that takes place also with these culturally responsive standards that will be interesting to see how they're implemented in these prep programs as we move forward. So it's nice to see Illinois doing well in this area. But let's just pause and have you chat one term in the box that you think of when you think of SEL, a term or a phrase, and we'll see what some of those themes are. Thank you, Terry is just on it. She's sharing that framework directly with you now. So thank you for that. So if you can find your chat box, it's my way of keeping you with me. Emotional wellness, students first, mental health advocacy, mindfulness, restorative practices, very prominent recently, building the entire students, the whole child movement comes with that. Mindfulness, again, self-aware, balance, that working for students, I love. self-regulation, behavior, whole student well-being. And ASCD does more with that whole child. It's definitely SEL, but that's some of their terminology. Relationship building, emotional awareness, excellent. And please keep those coming. I may be missing some of them that were shared, but clearly forever, SEL has been part of the mission of schools. We just haven't always used that term or done it with intention. Teachers haven't always recognized that they aren't just about academic outcomes, and school mission statements across the country reflect that. So let's get to SEL and marginalized students and look at some of that intersection. And so we want to start by just talking about the fact that we do know that SEL impacts student performance. And sometimes we promote that just as a way of justifying SEL, that we know that SEL is important for the sake of a student's development, but it really helps if you can show that it also leverages academic achievement, because that's unfortunately how so many of our schools are judged for success, is purely on how those test scores. And the fact of the matter is the 4 studies, 2 of them short-term, 2 of them long-term, that were meta-analysis of SEL programs that were implemented, determined that SEL does have a positive impact on student success, and specifically up to an 11% gain in academic achievement. And that CASEL very often cites those 4 studies as an argument for SEL, even though we know the argument is much broader than just academic achievement. But let's start with that, because that's very important for marginalized students, that SEL has a positive impact on academic achievement. So with that in mind, its power to help with the opportunity gap that we'll unpack in a moment becomes very important. But we also know from Goleman how emotional intelligence impacts your development. Greenberg did work on that. We know there's intrinsic values in terms of motivation and satisfaction, and specific SEL elements like grit and growth mindset that have been much more in the pop culture as well. We've seen good studies indicating positive outcomes from that. We've also seen criticisms, but there's very little that's established that doesn't also come with criticisms. So that opportunity gap is just something we've got to recognize as we look at this academic achievement, that impact SEL can have on it. I use the term opportunity gap very purposely. Achievement gap is the term that we've used more traditionally, and it implies that the students aren't achieving, that the students are doing something wrong. And the opportunity gap shifts that to recognizing that we as school institutions are not serving the needs of an entire group of students. And the data shows that that's been a chronic issue. So what are we as educational institutions going to do different to help these students who are not getting the same opportunities for success? And we can definitely see that that terminology makes a difference, that when you talk about achievement gap, you actually get less, lower levels of issue prioritization, rather than when you talk about racial inequality in educational outcomes. So it's important that we put that emphasis on our responsibility as schools and not on students as underperformers. Because that implies that they've done something wrong when we are actually the ones in charge of making that difference in their future success. We also want to point out that racial and cultural variations that don't meet the white norm are often seen as deficits, that we have a deficit framing that goes with marginalized populations, and that this has a very negative effect on student outcomes. And we've got to figure out a way to recenter our schools so that every student feels they're seen and valued, which is not something that happens with racial and culturally varied students. So with that in mind, let's also point out what the gap is. And it's a gap in grades, test scores, courses, dropout rates, college completion rates, all of those. There's a gap between African-American, Hispanic students and low income families versus the more dominant centering of our educational system right now, which is white or Caucasian students. And so, or higher affluent, not low income families. That's the other comparison for the low income families, the non-low income families. And so how can we achieve that, some changes to address that gap? And this is where we look at the research specifically to marginalized students and what it says. And some of it we find out is that practitioner perceptions changes how we see these students, and that very often terminology is used for marginalized students that is very negative regarding SEL, about how they're disaffected or disaffected or alienation, lack of commitment, with dropout issues. And yet we know that SEL has been demonstrated to have a positive impact on these factors that are associated with underperformance, specifically motivation and engagement. Moving off of the research side here, just wanting to again emphasize that need for us to feel passionate about addressing this opportunity gap and recognizing that SEL can be a tool in that regard. Unfortunately, we have had a lot of criticism of how SEL has been implemented, and that in fact, Deanna Simmons has said, hey, if you don't have SEL centered on equity, then is it really racism with a hug? And that was such a great line that it got a lot of traffic. But when you really think about it, SEL can be another way that we marginalize students if we aren't doing it well. And some of the ways that it's being criticized is that SEL as being centered on whiteness, and it's just another thing that we're saying, well, now it's not just marginalized students don't achieve academically, they don't have all these SEL skills. So they are lacking. And now this is another area we've got to fix those marginalized students, which is really horrifying to me, that we would now go beyond just demeaning the academic achievement to demeaning the individual's self through SEL, and start talking then about fixing behavior as helping them regulate, but using that term in a way that's very demeaning and negative versus, you have to just start controlling yourself versus what it's truly meant to be. And we know that the assets are there with students that are marginalized. In fact, in some ways, all the more necessary in order to survive the marginalization and racism that they're experiencing. And using grit just as an example, you can have a student that's just had so much perseverance to navigate all kinds of trauma in their life, but they come to school without their homework completed, it's only half done. And you could have a teacher saying, you don't have perseverance. You therefore, need SEL programming to teach you perseverance, instead of recognizing the great perseverance that it took to get half of it done and show up for school. And so how is it that we can harness SEL assets for achievement within the school environment? Because the assets exist in many dimensions of life, but may not be being demonstrated within the school environment in the ways that we expect it for academic success. So having a deficit framing is going to just be counterproductive. But if we can do it with an asset frame, it's really got great power, great possibility. But I want us to be aware that there's already a huge, a growing backlash that in fact SEL can be perpetuating racism.
So Catherine, we do have a question that came into the chat box.
Please.
It's from Tony, and they ask, do you know, or do you think the education system is too focused to solely benefit a Central European mindset and needs to be changed to be able to focus on a majority of topics that everyone should be aware about?
I definitely agree with the first part, but I'd love, Tony, if you can unmic and tell me more about the change to be able to focus on a majority of topics that everyone should be aware of.
Yeah, hi there. So I've always heard about the idea that the education system, like the way that America has perceived it, has always been focused on the majority of people. And, this was before, we started seeing a rise of immigrants coming into our country. And, more cultures have been coming in. And so far, you know, even as we have become more diverse, we have seen the same values of teaching the same types of lessons that only pertain to those who come from a Central European um, European mindset point of view. We see those types of students benefit the most, whereas other students, such as the Latino community, the Black community, the AAPI community, their representation in education is limited, if not non-existent, I should mean.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if there is any way that we as educators can start to change that type of implicit, uh, systematic types of expectations in our teaching in order to be accommodate to our more diverse students to help them feel represented in the education system.
Absolutely. I think the part I don't know is what will replace it, right? When you talk about that majority of topics everyone should be aware of, because there's such a richness that is not present that needs to become centered in our curriculum. But you're absolutely right. We have to look at all the ways that we center our education in a way that marginalizes our students who aren't fitting whatever that norm might be. And it goes beyond race. It certainly can be, that you don't see yourself in the literature, you don't see yourself in the posters, and that can be LGBTQ, that can be students who have four moms instead of one, that have grandma raising them, that there's just a million different ways that we tell students they are not fitting the norm, that we have to really rethink and do a much better job of not centering it on kind of a male Eurocentric tradition that is steeped with white privilege. So I definitely agree with you. I think that should be the talk you give next year, and I'd love to be a part of that. Because we have to do much more than just talk about SEL. We need to talk about how we're going to recenter our educational system. And I hope today we start with some ideas of how to do that, because I think when we get overwhelmed by issues like this, we have to recognize that every big change comes really from that rolling stone, from that first small step that's taken in a classroom or in a school that becomes a movement and a shift that has great results. And so today, everyone should walk away with some rolling stones, a stone that they can start with that we hope will then just gain momentum and bring about much bigger changes in our school system. But Tony, thank you for mentioning that. I fully endorse what you're saying. I think that's absolutely true, and it's part of the ongoing marginalization of our kids. So I got this chat box right now. Write yes in small letters if you're acquainted with efforts specifically to boost student academic achievement through student SEL skills in some way. Or if you've seen that SEL was the primary tool used to address academic achievement, give me all capital letters, just to see how many of you out there have seen some positive things. Oh, great. Excellent. All right, so there's my panel. My expert panel are all of you that have just typed yes in, because now we're going to start moving towards what makes a difference. And you've seen some of this making a difference. So by all means, let's start chatting and sharing as we move forward. But our next step is going to just be to look at what a study indicated regarding this, and then start looking at those specific examples of what we can do tomorrow. So this study looked at an interview of practitioners in 4 different intervention programs, all of them with students that were fitting as part of the opportunity gap with income, Latinx, Hispanic, or Black African American opportunity gaps represented within the intervention programs. And so there are interviews conducted and a survey conducted and an analysis of the student profile that I just outlined and of the program's design, trying to find out if there were particular things in SEL that made a difference. And through the interviews, it became very clear through narratives that relationships, attentions to the student's experience, their lived experience, promoting student self-confidence and advocacy and help seeking, and then cognitive regulation, all were important factors in the students experiencing success from the intervention programs. You know, cognitive regulation we do associate with with academic achievement, but these other areas we don't normally say, oh, well, let's really make sure our program is attending to the student experience or relational capacity in order to impact their academic achievement. But you had the practitioners who've seen these students experience success saying, no, that was really important. And so from this narrative, real specific things that were mentioned was this idea that they wanted to feel heard and respected. And this goes back to what Tony is saying. If you're really not experiencing that in your curriculum, it becomes all the more important that you're seeing that happening within your interactions with the adults, with teachers. They were learning how to work with adults and also having a sense of how to work with peers. And conflict resolution emerged as really important because when you think of it, they might feel in conflict with much of what is being set forth in front of them as a norm, that this culture is the norm, this race is the norm, this experience of life is the norm, and that's in conflict with their own lived experience. And so that ability to navigate that constant conflict, not to mention microaggressions and macroaggressions of racism that they would be experiencing. So the additional attention to the student made a huge difference. The teachers having more time to tend to them, more interaction with other teachers to talk kids, this idea of helping them to take risks, to know it's okay to fail because they feel this added burden of needing to perform and to fit in. And being able to self-advocate in order to remedy some of the conflicts or the gaps that they are experiencing in the classroom. All of those became very important. And you can see that also showed up in the surveys where that whole idea of conflict resolution and self-image and identity were prominent. Communalism, which is an area that was added to this particular study because it was particularly important qualities needed by marginalized students to navigate in society, also showed that it was very prominent, that need to have the skills to adapt to context and to develop connectedness. As you can see it from our discussion, if a student's marginalized, having that ability to adapt to challenging contexts and connectedness becomes all the more important and is a skill for development. So what we're suggesting here is maybe underperformance is not really about what the student is lacking, but maybe some of that opportunity gap or achievement gap, as it's too often called, is a reflection of them not feeling seen and their assets not being catalyzed for academic success. So similar to that perseverance or grit story that I told, the perseverance is there, it has not been channeled into the academic environment. We're not recognizing that, building on it, and helping them feel seen and reflected in their school experience. And I'd like to just give you two examples of that. With the marginalization, if you think of a student and the curriculum in the school and society all centering you, and that marginalized students, that students out on the margin not feeling that way, well, it would make sense that things like self-esteem and a growth mindset and purpose would be impacted by that. And similarly, racial battle fatigue is a term that came out in 2008, talking about how much stress and energy is spent dealing with the conditions of racism and marginalization, where you're supposed to represent an entire body of people, and you feel added scrutiny to represent, and you have to deal with inequities and those microaggressions. And that would make sense that racial battle fatigue would be something experienced as students are constantly adapting to challenging contexts and needing those conflict resolution skills. So what we're really, the study was indicating is that importance of relational skills and self-identity, and really targeting SEL development for academic achievement as an important way of addressing the opportunity gap. And specifically that we start helping students feel like they're seen, that put them away from the margins and be center in their learning experience, that alone could significantly impact academic achievement. And of course, this is a very limited study, but it gives us something to think about before we now go into our last section, which is what will we do tomorrow? What are some of those things? So let me open this up either by raising your hand or maybe putting something in the chat box. What are some ways that we don't center our students who are caught in the opportunity gap? Exactly what Tony was bringing up before. If you could just jot down, because if we can identify how we're not centering their lived experience in schools, we can start identifying what to do about it. I'm waiting.
You can, I was going to say, feel free to come off mute. Well, we did get one through the chat box now.
Thanks. So Kara, and I hope I'm saying your name right, is talking about we don't just find out what they're interested in, what they would like to learn, or how they think they learn best. That's great. I'm going to throw out that we talk about needing literature that is both a mirror and a window, that they see themselves in it, and they also see a window to new cultures and new experiences through it. We don't do enough of that. I can see that people were taking time to thoughtfully write these things. Let me read them really quickly. Adding in time for reflective questions to bring in the lived experience. Excellent. The assets of students who speak multiple languages. We talk about them not speaking English instead of celebrating the language they speak, and multilingual individuals. We assume everyone has that same situation. So like there's one Mother's Day craft, or I shouldn't call it a craft, an art project being done in May, rather than recognizing how many would be needed, using a lot of those norms. See, we may not ask about how their at-home lives are, content and assessment instead of individuals, social issues that pertain to students, time and resources, love it. And of course, history, and really integrating all of this. I was having a conversation the other day about how you can take a story like someone going and getting their hair cut, and then we can just say, okay, now it's a Black male who's going to get his hair cut, but we don't change what that story would be. You know, is the student getting a line in their hair? What is that experience of the barbershop that has some cultural expectations with it? Are we changing the story in any way, or are we just kind of colorizing the individuals? But so too, what I'm seeing too much of is that you don't get the haircut story, that if you're going to have the Black male, it's a story of them reading about Martin Luther King and fighting the struggle, instead of a student also being able to recognize their daily lived experience within that multicultural literature that's being brought into the classroom. So can we find books that are not always about the history, but about the reality of living a life in society, just as every other individual does, and not have all of those normed books be of daily experience be white centered, both in detail and in the actual characters that are represented. I love the things that are being shared. I love that the disabilities is coming in. Ableism is certainly a big aspect as well. Again, that's come up as too often. We're sharing a tweet about a person who happens to have a disability achieving something as if that's more noteworthy because they had the disability, rather than recognizing it's because of the virtues of the individual that they achieved that. And so we can be perpetuating some of these stereotypes. These are great. I'm gonna ask you to continue to unpack those as we now go to how to build on assets. And so some of the things we want to take a look at is that we need to start seeing social emotional in our schools as just as important as any content area. We want to make sure that we adopt strategies that foster a culture of belonging for all students. And we also want to make sure that teachers are asset-based in their development of SEL, and that we recognize its power to address racism if done well, rather than helping to perpetuate it. So that we have to start by avoiding deficit framing, that SEL should be about assets and building on them, that everyone has assets. How are we building on them and expanding on that? And that there's a difference between having SEL assets in one environment and in an academic environment. So how can we harness that and help students to self-identify and celebrate their strengths? It's about building one-on-one relationships, learning from marginalized students. And didn't your comments just speak to that, about wanting to learn more about our students and their lived experience and bring that into the classroom, to center them, to discover how the school sends implicit messaging that they aren't who matters, and see how we can deconstruct that, and to go towards our areas of discomfort and learn. So when we see groups of individuals, even in our own lives, that seem very different from us and that it's gonna be an uncomfortable experience, that we, instead of avoiding it, we seek that out. We bravely go where our discomfort is in order to break down those barriers and build new understandings. And that growth mindset is so applicable to us as adults, that we're okay with knowing we're going to mess this up as we do a better job of broadening our understandings of all people and all lived experiences. And it doesn't matter what race, what cultural background, we all have much to learn about other people's lived experiences. And that we try to build community, that we help our marginalized students feel that they have the support of others, of other students, of teachers, of mentors who have achieved success, so that we break down these images that are constantly reinforced them in their mind of inferiority, and that they instead see access to achievement. And that term I threw out of transformative SEL, what does that mean? That is one that's centered on equity work, and it promotes a sense of belonging and an agency and empowerment, and really that idea of building environments that embrace students as their lived experience. So now's when I want to kind of open this up more to a dialogue, and a sharing of specific things that you think you could do to better harness the assets of marginalized students, and how you can use SEL development specifically as a way to help close the opportunity gap that these marginalized students are experiencing. So I haven't had a chance to read all the comments, full disclosure, as I talk away. So some of these ideas may be tucked very clearly within those comments, but let me open it up at this time. Tony, I see, is mentioning the savior complex. And I think that's a good thing for us to address. Does anyone want to make any comments about that savior complex, that sense that somehow there's kind of this like, let us bring up these students who are suffering and marginalized, rather than recognizing the deficit that we have by not enjoying the richness of their contributions. And in fact, there's plenty of research that shows that white students have much to benefit from a better job of centering diverse experiences in the classroom, instead of what we are currently doing, where we are centering the dominant culture of privilege, and that organizations actually operate better with diversity as an asset. But any comments about that? I think we have trouble understanding that disability isn't bad or unnatural. And feel free. I can give you a moment to read this very intriguing chat, or if anyone would like to share verbally by unmuting, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, hi, sorry, it's me again. So what I meant by the whole savior complex, oftentimes I've seen that, like, and it's like what Terry said in the chat, it's not like they're intentionally doing it. Oftentimes it's just kind of the mindset that people grow up with, like, oh, I'm here to help the students, try to make them better than what most teachers like did with me or other students, when it shouldn't be. The main focus of being a teacher shouldn't be about the teacher, it's about the students. It's not necessarily trying to make the students better in any way. It's more about supporting them through challenges that they are capable of achieving, to getting through on their own. It's just, again, providing that support and those resources that they just need a little bit help with getting through. And unfortunately, we just see too many people misinterpret that whole desire to help students as a way for them to kind of boost their own credibility in a sense, and that it's just it really stinks whenever a student is kind of forced in that situation, because unfortunately they don't get any benefits from it. In fact, it just makes their whole situation worse.
Well said. And I see Kara and Kathleen and others saying some real specific things that they try to do to center their students. So feel free to share.
I think my name is Jessica. I'm a graduate student at Lewis University in chemistry, secondary. I think STEM in particular, as well as being a Black woman, is just really is going to be important for me to make those conversations normal. Like, we should be having these conversations. It shouldn't feel uncomfortable because we're talking about it. We're talking about how it feels to find and I'm just speaking specifically for science, a STEM identity as a person of color and as a woman when that's not the majority, or just what is relevant to you. And I think that's where we miss the ball a lot of the time. And I mean, I'm a pre-service teacher, but I've worked in education for a long time, so I'm switching into the classroom. So from what I've seen and what I've talked about with students that I've mentored, is just, how does this apply to me? And so I feel like if we're bringing those questions and letting students like say, well, what is it that you want to know? And how is that relevant to your everyday life? That's one of like my enduring understandings, I think, going into it, is just like, how does this connect to me? How does this connect to my life? What can I bring home from Miss Bradley's class today that will help me make a meal with my mom? Chemistry. Okay. What is that? What's going to tie it together? So I think that's important. And I think that brings in that SEL, because I mean, we're emotional beings. And so you can't take emotion out of learning. It's all emotional. And so if we understand that, we make it relevant, we continue to have conversations so it doesn't feel uncomfortable, then I think that is a good place to start. That's where I'll start, at least.
Sorry, I muted myself. Amen. I totally agree. Well said. Others? I'm loving these chats, but if anyone else would like to share aloud, we'd love to hear your comments as well. Well, let me, as I wrap up my part, leave you there. This is just a quick way that you can access a copy of this PowerPoint if you're interested. It's on the landing page, recent presentations. But I know that Jan is always on it and will be posting it also at the center website. But I hope you see today as two things. One is a start in considering that maybe the addressing a student's SEL is addressing someone's academic. That in fact, having that conversation where you help a student feel seen and cared for and in relationship, where you want to learn more about them and their lived experience, that may in fact be one of the best things you can do for their academic achievement. And that we may spend too much time giving more of the same in terms of interventions, like we're going to teach it again another time, instead of recognizing how much that lack of being seen and their lived experience reflected is impacting that academics. And so that's the first, is to just try to make that connection. And the other is that you walk away with a real specific, what I'm calling the Rolling Stone, a real specific thing that you are going to try to do that you believe can make a difference in this anti-racism work. And it might not even come from today's presentation, though I hope it does. It may come from something else today, but that we're actionable on this, that it's not just a heady conversation, but that in fact, we feel an obligation to do more. Because the opportunity gap is not our students' issue. It's our institutional and structural systems that need to change in order to help these students who are not being served by us. And I want us to all feel kind of an urgency to do so and to do so well. And if you want inspiration, read that chat box, because I think there's just a lot of beautiful thoughts and ideas that are being represented. And I want to thank you so much for the gift of this time with you today. So I'm going to turn things back to Terry.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. And I'm seeing lots of kudos and thank yous in the chat box as well coming through. There's just a couple kind of housekeeping sorts of items at the end of this session that we're going to go ahead and take care of. So I'm posting two links. There's one to the evaluation of the session, and then the other one is the evidence of completion. And so you have those two links in the chat, sorry. And somebody's also mentioning to everybody that you can save the chat if you click on those three dots. So if you want to keep hold of this conversation and maybe go back